Is this on? Yes. For inviting me. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. Um, I was instructed that I would have 10 minutes to make my comments, but now that we've missed one speaker, maybe I'll have a few extra minutes. And I thought what I would do is use the time to raise a series of issues, questions, as a sort of curtain raiser to the conversation. And I think which goes to the heart of the title of this event, Changing Campus Cultures and the Future of South African Universities. Much of my academic life has been outside of South Africa, but of course I've been very closely linked to South Africa in many different ways. And I think that a lot of what is happening in South African universities is in many ways similar, but we have our own distinct struggles here. So the first issue or question that I thought I would raise is the question of what are the drivers of change beyond the calls for decolonization and transformation, which has been part of what we are talking about right now. But if you look just at the last few decades, the drivers of change at higher education institutions globally, firstly, the rise of technology and a kind of revolutionary kind of technology that really affects university culture. Artificial intelligence has and will continue to change the culture as well. Just yesterday I saw a brief report about a study that was done comparing robots and dermatologists identifying skin cancer. And the robots they were much, much more successful than human beings in identifying cancer growths. That's just an example. And of course, the business model. 2008 really did change the way that we began to, certainly in the United States, I was a professor then in the United States, the market crash. So we have in this country as well, those are also drivers of change in addition to this question of transformation and decolonization. And of course, we need to be mindful of our constitutional promise, the idea of access and inclusion at universities, and then this question of decolonization, which is a word that has so many, many multiple meanings, and I think it's a very, very exciting project. The second issue, the second sort of question that I think we need to address when we think about campus culture is really this hackneyed question about the role and the identity of universities. Universities have always been key players in the sort of production of knowledge, in information and ideas. And we now know that we're living in a society and in a world in which knowledge is replacing other resources as the main driver of economic growth. So we ask the question here, what does a South African university look like in Africa in the 21st century, which is an important question, but it also is about what does a South African university look like in a globalized world in which the luxury of national identity and national imperatives has to compete with global and other cosmopolitan concerns. So I think this question about the role and identity is constantly an issue that affects how we think about culture. Then the third point that I wanted to raise is the point of access. Because if fees must fall, hashtag roads must fall, these movements, they really have been about access. And we have begun to think, when I look at the conversations, when I look at the literature and the research, there have been very few people who've actually begun to think about access, not just in terms of who goes to university and how we create access, but also what our universities should look like, and maybe we should think about a differentiated system. So Professor Habib, I know, has given a lecture, I think it was a lecture at the University College London some years ago, around this question of differentiated universities. And what do I mean? I'm thinking here, for example, of community colleges in the United States. I'm thinking of sort of technical colleges in Europe and so on. So the one-size-fits-all university, we really need to disentangle that and think about how we think about a differentiated system that leads to access. And we're bound by our apartheid history and the history of black universities being deprived of resources, being in some ways the stepchildren of the university system. But that should not preclude us from having a serious conversation around access and how a differentiated university system might satisfy that. And that is also linked to the identity and role of universities. Then the fourth issue that I wanted to raise was this question of the learning and the personal and professional development of students. And the question I began to think about these sort of quote-unquote culture wars that happen on campus, and this call for safe spaces and inclusivity and belonging and so on. And the question I really want to raise is, what are the permissible limits of discomfort in the pursuit of knowledge? I mean, if we go to university, we expect students to expand the intellectual bandwidth. And part of that has to include very, very uncomfortable moments and ways in which we engage with each other and raise difficult questions. So the question is how we moderate contestations around different epistemological traditions, legacies, and so on. The ways of being. So this idea about what we think of this person who comes to university and what we think of the end product. I don't mean to be crude about it, but this idea about what happens and what are the processes in not just knowledge production, but this personal and professional, the personal and professional development. And then this link to this question is again this issue of inclusivity. What does it mean to feel at home and to belong at a university? I mean, what is the culture? How should the culture accommodate somebody who comes from the Cape Flats, who is in an environment where, no question, a stranger? But I always tell students, going to university is like going to a foreign country. Different people, different ways of doing and so on. So we really need to sort of question how much we should accommodate this sort of growth and development. In other words, we should interrogate this call for safe spaces. That's very much part of the debate around culture. Then another issue that I thought thinking about changing the cultures is this question of relationships. Relationships between students, relationships between students and academics, relationships between academics themselves, relationships between academics and administration. And how do we think about these relationships if we want to talk about a different kind of culture? And I'm raising these as questions because I don't have the answer. Maybe, Professor Habib might have answers about this, but I think that if we think about the hierarchical classroom, which is so much part of the university system, and this is something that students have raised and everybody raises, what really does it mean? And it's not just hierarchy in the classroom, but it's hierarchy across, different actors within the academic sphere, lecturers, professors, and so on. And linked to that as well is this idea of merit and how we gauge excellence. It's a contested idea. I think that there has been quite a bit of research around this question of merit, excellence, equity, and so on. And I think we constantly need to think about that with respect to university cultures. Another question that I think needs to be attached to this issue of university cultures and the future of universities is what we do about the politics that have surfaced on campus. And maybe I've just been immersed at UCT, and what I've sort of seen as a sort of the politics of humiliation, a politics of bullying. We've seen that. And the spouting of illiberal ideas through sort of liberal notions that we value as an institution. I think this is something that all universities is confronting. I know at the University of Cape Town, it is difficult to really engage with sort of ideas that aren't necessarily part of the progressive project that we embarked on before 1994, which is also linked to another question, and that is the kinds of racial politics that have emerged, not just on the campuses, but in the country, and how we begin to think about our sort of commitment to non-racialism and what it means when when we've seen black students on historically white campuses engage and struggle through what some have called, traumatic encounters. How do we hold on to that idea of a non-racial cosmopolitan university that really does embrace difference at a very fundamental level? And also, how do we embrace nuance and complexity and conditionality, which is part of not just our condition here in South Africa, but the human condition? And then finally, I think an issue for me that goes to the heart of this question of campus cultures is the question of leadership. And not just the idea of how we've progressed from the old white boys club of leadership, particularly at the elite universities in this country, but what does it mean to have racially representative leaders in this changing and sort of transformed culture at universities? And what is the role of these leaders? What are their expectations, and how do they balance their expectations around demands, for example, higher rankings, more research output, etc., etc.? And then the final issue that I would like to raise is the question of the actual structure of universities, the institutional structures that go to the way that the culture plays out in various ways. So, where are the incentives for changing university cultures? Who has the power to change the culture? In other words, sort of, where are people located who are calling for a change, assuming that they actually have some sense, some shared sense of a different kind of culture, and how is that possible? So, for example, I think that if you look at the university where most of the culture is concentrated, it's sort of people who are almost on their way to retirement. And this is not an ageist argument, but there's a way in which the power lies in the place with individuals who, in essence, are no longer invested in the university with respect to their own futures. I'm not saying that those who are within 5 years or whatever number of years of retirement aren't interested in change, but the change definitely is much, much more profound and much louder in a sort of more junior set and in the student body who are also transient. So I thought I'd raise those issues just as a sort of as a curtain raiser and hand it over to Professor Habib. Thank you.